Let us continue with the ongoing debate on Western and non Western perspectives of human rights. Alongside NAM, the group of 77, that is G77, was formed in 1964 to give developing countries collective voice in global economic matters and, of course, political also. But primacy was given to the economic development. Initially composed of 77 nations, the group has since uh, expanded, but it retains its original name, the G77. The group worked with the United Nations framework to advocate for the interests of the global south. Its central demands include fairer terms of trade, economic assistance, technology transfer, and support for industrialization. These countries argued that political independence was meaningless without economic independence. They highlighted the structural inequalities created by centuries of colonialism and insisted that developed countries bore responsibility to correct them. For the G77, human rights included not just individual freedoms but also the right to development. They saw poverty, hunger, and underdevelopment as violations of human dignity. The perspectives contrasted sharply with the Western emphasis on political liberties alone. The rise of the G77 also changed voting dynamics in the United Nations General Assembly. With their numerical strength, developing nations could push resolutions and influence debates, often against the wishes of the powerful nations, um, particularly the Western states. This unity of the South created anxiety in the North. Incidentally, all the developed rich countries were in the Northern Hemisphere, and all the poor erstwhile colonies were in the Southern Hemisphere, and they all were underdeveloped or developing countries. So, this created anxiety in the minds of the countries in the North, leading developed countries, whether capitalist or socialist, to sometimes cooperate with each other to resist demands. The G77 marked a shift in the human rights debate from being primarily East versus West to being North versus South. It emphasized that justice between nations was as important as justice within nations. As decolonization advanced, the global debates on human rights shifted from East versus West to North versus South. So were the Cold War equations. The North generally referred to developed, industrialized countries, mostly located in the Northern Hemisphere, while the South referred to poorer, developing nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. North South divide was not only geographic but also economic and political. Wealthy nations had advanced technology, strong economies, and powerful institutions, while the South struggled with poverty, weak governance, and underdevelopment. The South demanded international solidarity and assistance, arguing that without economic progress, the promise of human rights would remain hollow. The North, however, often resisted these demands. Developed countries insisted that aid and technology transfer should be linked to political reforms, democracy, and respect for human rights as they defined them. This created frustration in the South, where leaders saw such conditions as new forms of control or neo-colonialism. Human rights thus became a bargaining tool in global politics. Western nations used them to set conditions for loans, trade, and partnerships, while developing nations accused the West of hypocrisy and double standards. The North South divide highlighted how human rights were deeply tied to questions of global inequality, justice, and power, or else global inequality, injustice, and unequal power equations. This divide remains relevant even today as debates over development aid, uh, climate change, and global governance continue to reflect the same tensions between North and South. The Global South, particularly through NAM and G77, raised several key demands in the international arena. They insisted that human rights could not be separated from economic justice and development. For them, poverty and underdevelopment were among the greatest violations of human dignity. First, they demanded financial assistance from developed nations. This was seen not as charity but as compensation for centuries of colonial exploitation. Second, they called for the transfer of technology to help industrialize their economies and reduce dependence on the North. Third, they advocated for fairer trade practices, challenging the dominance of international corporations. To challenge the domination of international corporations, multinationals, and unfair pricing of raw materials. The South also stressed the right to development as a human right. They argued that without schools, hospitals, housing, and jobs, civil and political rights meant little. They wanted human rights to include collective dimensions such as the rights of nation to self-determination, economic sovereignty, and of course cultural preservation. Developed countries, however, were reluctant to accept these demands. They often linked economic aid to political reforms, insisting that recipient states establish democracy and ensure basic freedoms list. This conditionality was perceived by the South as interference in domestic affairs. These tensions made clear that the human rights agenda was not neutral. It was deeply shaped by power relations between North and South. The demands of the global South expanded the meaning of rights but also exposed the limits of international cooperation. The rise of the global south fundamentally altered global politics. The unity of newly independent nations in forums like NAM and the G77 forced the developed countries of the North to reconsider their strategies. Instead of focusing only on their East West rivalry, capitalist and socialist states sometimes worked together to counter the growing strength and influence of the South. For the North, the demand of the South for aid, technology, and fair trade was seen as a threat to their economic and political dominance, rather hegemony. They responded by using human rights as a diplomatic tool. Assistance was often made conditional upon adopting Western style democracy and liberal human rights standards along with liberal market economy. This conditionality created resentment among developing nations who felt their cultural and social realities were ignored. At the same time, new rights emerged, such as the right to development. The South argued that development was a prerequisite for the enjoyment of all other rights. The North, however, often countered by insisting that democracy and human rights must come first. This clash reflected the deeper conflict of interest between preserving power and seeking justice. Thus, the shifts in global politics was not only about East West rivalry but also about North South struggles. Human rights became both a language of hope for oppressed peoples and a tool of diplomacy for powerful nations. Understanding this shift is essential to grasping why debates over Western and non Western perspectives on rights remain unresolved. This part has traced the early evolution of the human rights debate from a universal idea to contested political tool. We began by discussing the philosophical roots of rights, showing that while West codified them into modern legal frameworks, their moral foundations exist across cultures. We then examined how democracy and human rights are interconnected yet interpreted differently across contexts. The role of the United Nations was central, particularly with the adoption of UDHR in 1948 and the two covenants in 1966. However, enforcement was weak and Cold War politics overshadowed commitments to right. Uh, the ideological conflict between the US and the erstwhile USSR divided rights into competing categories, weakening universality. Decolonization brought new voices into the conversations. Newly independent nations highlighted sovereignty, development, and self determination as essential rights. Through NAM and the G77, they demanded economic justice and a fairer world order. This shifted the human rights debate from East versus West to North versus South conflict, revealing deep inequalities in the global system. Human rights thus emerged as both a moral ideal and a political instrument. While the universal spirit remained inspiring, the struggle over implementation reflects power, interest, and cultural identity, cultural diversity. In the part, we will explore how these debates continued with issues like child rights, women's rights, cultural relativism, and the accusations of the Western double standard, and the politics, the global politics related to all these various kinds of rights. This will help us see how the Western non Western debate developed further in later decades. Before we begin the new section, let us quickly recap what we learned in part 1 of our discussion on human rights. We saw that the debate on whether human rights are Western or non Western is not simple. Some argued that rights originated mainly from Western liberal traditions like the Enlightenment, while others showed that all civilizations, including those in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, have always respected human dignity, justice, and equality, and they were present in some or other form in these societies also. This makes human rights a truly universal idea. We also explored the link between democracy and human rights. While democracy offers a political system to safeguard rights, rights are broader than democracy and exist in many forms across cultures. We then looked at the role of the United Nations, starting with the UDHR in 1948. The UDHR was undoubtedly a milestone, but it lacked strong enforcement power as it was a declaration, not binding. During the Cold War, the human rights agenda was divided. Western countries highlighted civil and political rights, while communist or the socialist states focused on economic and social rights. Meanwhile, newly independent nations from Asia and Africa emphasized sovereignty, development, and self determination as rights. This shifted the debate from an East versus West rivalry to a North South struggle. Thus, part 1 showed us that human rights are both universal and political, shaped by culture, power, and historical struggle. Now, in this section, we explore how human rights became a diplomatic tool during the Cold War and after. While the Universal Declaration of Human Rights had inspired people across the world, its enforcement was deeply shaped by the then international politics. Western nations often used human rights to criticize rivals but ignored violations of their allies. For example, the United States condemned Soviet Union for repressing civil and political liberties and supported authoritarian, but it itself supported authoritarian regimes in Latin America and the Middle East that committed gross abuses. Similarly, the Soviet Union highlighted racial segregation and inequality in the United States and the allies countries while overlooking its own censorship, labor camps, Iron Curtain, and lack of political freedom. This selectivity weakened the universality of human rights. Rights were used as a bargaining chip in international relations rather than as a genuine, consistent principle. Developing countries also felt betrayed because their struggle for economic justice were often sidelined. They accused the West of using aid and loans as leverage, tying financial help to conditions about governance and rights. This conditionality was seen as political interference and a form of neo colonial control. As a result, many in the global south viewed the human rights discourse as hypocritical. Instead of creating trust, it deepened mistrust. Human rights, rather than being a shield for the vulnerable, sometimes became a weapon of diplomacy in the hands of the strong. This undermined credibility and made many countries skeptical about of the Western traditions. The idea of the right to development emerged strongly in the 1970s and 80s. Many developing nations argued that Poverty, hunger, and underdevelopment were themselves violations of human rights. They insisted that political freedoms had little meaning if people lacked food, shelter, and jobs, that is, the basic necessities. This perspective broadened the human rights framework beyond civil and political rights. The United Nations responded to these demands by adopting the Declaration on the Right to Development in 1986. This document recognized development as a human right and placed obligations not only on states but also on international community to support equitable growth. And not only international community but on the regional communities also, on the civil society, NGOs and people also. For the global south, this was a major victory because it acknowledged that justice and dignity required more than legal framework. They required material well-being. However, the global north resisted turning the right to development into binding legal obligations. Wealthy nations were reluctant to commit to financial transfers, technology sharing, or systematic reforms that might reduce global inequalities. They argued that development was the responsibility of individual states and that aid should not be seen as a right. This debate remains relevant even today, especially in discussion about climate change, global trade, and debt relief. Developing nations continue to demand that economic justice and sustainability be treated as a human right. The right to development thus highlights the ongoing tension between universality and inequality in the global system. One of the most significant milestone in human rights was the adoption of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that is CRC, in 1989. It became the most widely ratified human rights treaty in history, showing global agreement on on protecting children and their rights. The CRC recognized children as individuals with right to education, health care, protection from exploitation, and opportunities for development. The convention was a breakthrough because it gave children legal standing as right holders, not just dependents. It also set universal standards for child welfare, including bans on child labor, child marriage, and recruitment into armed forces. For many activists, the CRC symbolized hope that the world would unite to safeguard the most vulnerable members of the society. However, the implementation of child rights faced challenges. In poorer nations, economic realities often clash with these standards. For instance, millions of families relied on child labor for survival, making outright bans uh, difficult to be enforced. Critics argued that the CRC sometimes ignored the context of poverty and imposed unrealistic expectations. Despite these issues, the CRC inspired reforms worldwide. Governments introduced new laws, and NGOs launched campaigns for child protection, education, and health. While not perfect, the convention remains one of the strongest examples of global consensus on human rights. It shows both the promise and the practical difficulties of making rights meaningful. Thus, with CRC, child rights were acknowledged as a human right. And this is the biggest achievement of the human rights regimen, that it not only recognizes rights of an individual, rights of man and women, rights of human beings, but besides general rights which are available to everyone, there are specific group rights that address the issues and problems of particular groups like children, women, disabled, etc. etc. Another key debate in human rights is women's rights, particularly the balance between universality and cultural traditions. In 1979, the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that is CEDAW. It is often called the Bill of Rights for Women because it provided a comprehensive framework to fight gender discrimination. CEDAW required states to ensure equality in education, employment, marriage, and family life. It challenged practices such as forced marriage, unequal inheritance rights, and gender-based violence. For women worldwide, it became a powerful tool to demand justice. Yet, many countries entered reservations to CEDAW, especially on issues related to family law, marriage, and cultural traditions, particularly the that is also called as the personal laws. India is also in the list of those countries who have demanded some more time to reform the personal laws, which are highly discriminatory to women. Though India is making progress in bringing about gender equality in the matters related to personal laws in case of certain communities like Hindu community way back in 1955, much before CEDAW. And beginning with 1954-55, we have uh, we have achieved a lot in terms of legal equality for Hindu women in the matters of personal law. Many other communities like Christians and Parsis have also come up with their own package of reformation in personal laws, realizing the need of the hour and realizing the importance of giving equality to women in matters of uh, marriage, divorce, inheritance, etc., etc. But there are still communities that need to work in this area. Now, the countries argued that some provisions clash with religious or social values, same as in case of India. There are communities who believe that equality, gender equality in matters of personal laws is against their cultural and religious or social values, and any kind of state interference will be considered as an intervention in the religious freedom, cultural freedom, and the minority rights of that particular community. Many states consequently have resisted reforms to inheritance or divorce laws, claiming they were based on sacred traditions. This raised the larger questions of cultural relativism. Should universal rights override cultural practices? Or should traditions be respected even if they limit equality? Western countries often pushed for strict universality, while many non Western nations stressed cultural autonomy. Even leave aside the non-Western countries, there are groups of refugees settled in Western countries, and one can see a clear clash of laws in the universal, which are guaranteed, which are guaranteeing universal human rights to people at large, and the gender unequal laws of those refugee communities. And often there is a tussle between the state giving refuge to these communities, between universal human rights and their cultural autonomy. Despite these tensions, CEDAW strengthened women's movements worldwide. Activists used it to challenge discriminatory laws and demand reforms. Women's rights thus remain a dynamic but contested area, highlighting the constant negotiation between global principles and local realities. One of the most debated issues in human rights is the clash between universalism and cultural relativism. Universalism argues that rights apply equally to all people, regardless of where they live or what culture they belong to. It is based on the belief that dignity, equality, and freedom are shared human values. Cultural relativism, on the other hand, says that rights must be understood within cultural, religious, and social traditions. It suggests that no single culture has the authority to define what is right for everyone. This debate often becomes heated. For example, practices like arranged marriages, wailing of women, or family laws about inheritance, rather unequal family laws about inheritance, are defended by some societies as cultural traditions but criticized by others as violations of human rights. Western countries are often accused of cultural arrogance, imposing their values on the rest of the world. At the same time, cultural relativism has been misused by authoritarian governments to justify abuses like censorship, gender inequality, or denial of political freedom. Many inhuman practices like female circumcision are also justified in the name of cultural autonomy. A balanced approach is therefore necessary. In the name of cultural autonomy, we cannot in 21st centuries allow inhuman practices like female circumcision, child marriages. We cannot deny a widow a right to remarry. We cannot deny equal property rights to women in this era of empowerment. We have to definitely take cognizance of these universal human rights when we are talking about women empowerment. We need a balanced approach. While the principles of dignity and equality are universal, the way they are applied can differ across societies. For example, education for all is a universal right, but how schools operate may depend on local traditions. This middle path ensures that human rights remain globally credible while respecting diversities. But definitely, in the name of cultural autonomy, we cannot deny women an access to education or their choice of profession in the name of veil or cultural traditions. A major challenge to the legitimacy of human rights has been the double standard of Western countries. On many occasions, well, I would say the double standard of Western countries on the one side and adamant or arrogant attitude in the name of cultural relativism and cultural autonomy by many communities of Africa, Asia, uh, and of course, a number of religious groups. Well, on many occasions, the West has promoted human rights abroad but ignored them when they conflicted with its national interests. This is true. This is all about human rights politics and the use of human rights as an ideology to justify their own ill deeds and at the same time to protect their own interest. For example, during the Cold War, the United States supported authoritarian regimes in Latin America, Africa, and Asia as long as they opposed communism. These regimes often engaged in torture, disappearances, and censorship, yet they received military and financial support from United States of America, the flag marcher of democracy and human rights. Similarly, European powers were slow to address the legacies of colonialism and exploitation. Even while promoting democracy and freedom at home, they maintained control over colonies or supported regimes that denied people basic rights. This selective application created a credibility crisis. Critics argue that interventions in the name of human rights often served economic or strategic interest of the powerful nations, such as access to resources or markets. This gave the impression that rights were less about principles and more about political convenience and political expediency. For the global south, such hypocrisy deepened mistrust. Countries felt that the West only cared about rights when it suited them or served their national interests and ignored them otherwise. These double standards weaken the authority of Western nations and fueled accusations that human rights were simply tools of power politics. Thank you. We'll continue in next lecture.